It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. And with me today, Conservative MP Laura Farris, Labour's leader in Scotland Anna Sarwar, The Spectator's economics editor Kate Andrews, and author and broadcaster Emma DeBerry. Today, the Prime Minister says
Levelling up is not a jam-spreading operation. It's not robbing Peter to pay Paul, it's not zero-sum, it's win-win for the whole United Kingdom.
The Prime Minister saying that his levelling up agenda won't make richer areas poorer, so what will it do? 700 Nissan workers in Sunderland are forced to self-isolate after being pinged by the NHS app. Are we in the midst of a pingdemic? Also today, is the UK in denial about racism? One of our guests today thinks so, and we'll debate that.
You're not going to break this junk food cycle, this interaction between our appetite and the commercial incentive of companies unless you tackle it directly.
And do we need a tax on unhealthy food to tackle obesity? And let's start with that topic today. It's a pretty controversial one. People have lots of views about this. And it's all based around the National Food Strategy. Let's see how the Daily Mail has reported it today. It says, war on obese Britain, snack tax to fight fat crisis. Now, the idea is that Henry Dimbleby has been looking into what can be done. He says that we've got too much dependence on high fat, high sugar, high salt products, and something has to be done about it. He's saying that the cost of a Mars bar, if this tax was put onto the suppliers, would go up by from 65p to 74p. A box of Frosties would cost 87p more. There are lots of other products which would be affected by this as well. So let's start with all of that. And first of all, to you, Laura, do you think that this is a good idea?
Well, I don't think we can deny that there is an obesity crisis in this country, and I don't think we can deny that it's going to take pretty unflinching measures to tackle it. I think it's always eye-catching when you sort of see favourite foods being listed as more expensive, and immediately it provokes a public reaction. But I think the truth is that if those foods were accepted, if that recommendation was accepted by the government, you'd get to a position where I think other producers would very quickly produce, less sugary, less unhealthy equivalents that would come on the market. And I think you'd see a competitive, product in this emerging very quickly. So I'm afraid to say I do think the government needs to consider very carefully this report, and it needs to take radical action to tackle the obesity crisis.
Anas, do you think it's a good idea?
Look, I think undoubtedly we have an obesity crisis, but you can't separate that from the fact we have a poverty crisis in this country. And rather than making unhealthy foods more expensive and therefore pushing more people into further poverty, what we should be looking at is how we make healthy food less expensive and how we put more money into low-income households' pockets so they're able to buy that healthy food. So I'm all in favour of looking at pricing and the role that pricing plays. For example, the sugar tax on drinks is one example of that. But let's not separate it from the wider poverty crisis. The cut in universal credit, that's not going to help. Getting more money into families' pockets and helping encourage healthy lifestyles, I think, is a more appropriate way of going forward.
Kate, what do you make of it?
I think it's a terrible idea. You look around the world where sugar taxes have been tried and they don't cut obesity. This report itself acknowledges that it thinks that this policy may cut between 15 to 40 calories consumed by an individual a day. It's not going to do anything to curb obesity. The reality is that the government is running out of money, it's running out of places to tax, and so campaigners who would like to control more lives, more adults' lives, who should be in a position to make their own free decisions, are now conveniently looking for areas to flag to the government that they can tax. And it's not obvious to me at all that this will actually curb obesity. It's really just a way of interfering in our lifestyles once again. Frankly, it's the nanny state gone mad.
And Emma DeBerry, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with the comments about poverty. You know, that's what the real issue is here, the huge poverty and the vast inequality that kind of characterises life in the UK today.
I think.
And Laura, just to come to you, the Prime Minister's just been asked about this, actually, at a speech he's been making. And he says that although it's doubtless a good idea, he says he's not attracted to the idea of extra taxes on hard-working people. This is never going to happen, is it?
Well, I mean, the government has given itself 6 months to consider its response, and it will come back with a white paper. But I think if we're talking about poverty, we can't deny that when we look at obesity, that the higher rates of obesity are among those of the lowest income. And if we want to talk about health inequalities and we want to get into the terrain of meaningfully changing the outcomes of those who live in the poorest parts of our society, then tackling obesity is a part of that. And I do think that some pretty radical action is required. Otherwise, we will press on.
I mean, extra taxes?
I'm not going to kind of go as far as that, but with 2/3 of our adult population obese and seeing it increasingly through primary schools, I don't think we can sort of sit back and hope that it's a problem that will correct itself. And I do think it's going to require a strategy from the government, quite a direct strategy that will have an interventionist effect.
And do you agree with that, Anna?
I think the strategy and the...
Anna's first. We'll come to you in a second, Kate.
Look, I agree it needs a strategy, but you can't separate different parts of government response from different impacts on communities. So you can't, on one hand, push further communities into poverty across the country.
But what do you do? That lots of people agree that is a problem with obesity.
It has to be a package of measures, and the package of measures has to be, one, how you get more people back into work and well-paid work. How you support people, for example, through universal credit and through the welfare system to make sure they have got adequate support for their families. How do you allow people to make healthy choices? Evidence shows that if you put more money into low-income households' families, they do buy healthier products as a result. So how do you make healthier products more cheap rather than making unhealthy products more expensive and pushing people further into poverty? So yes, let's have an obesity strategy, but it can't be separate from every other government policy that we have. It's got to be rooted in the wider government strategy about how we create a fairer society, a more equal economy, fight those inequalities that exist in our society and bring poverty down. That should be our global mission in this country, to end child poverty, to end poverty in the round. And if you do that, you'll fight obesity head on at the same time.
But the plan, as Henry Dimbleby has laid it out, is that the revenue raised would go so that GPs can actually prescribe fruit and vegetables.
Look, I don't like the sound of prescribed fruit and vegetables as if fruit and vegetable is some kind of medicine that you really don't like to take because it tastes really bad. And
I think a lot of children would agree
all the rest of it. So we've got to actually make it more interesting for people to eat healthy foods rather than saying it tastes like some kind of horrible medicine, acid-like medicine that dentists like me wouldn't be happy about.
Emma, I think you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, no, I just completely agree with, I would just echo what's been said. And it's this atomized approach to issues that is the problem, probably for most of the topics that we'll be talking about today, for most of the issues, you know, that we're currently battling against. It's looking at things in this really piecemeal fashion rather than looking at everything more holistically and seeing the way that, you know, poverty, inequality, racism, characterize life in this country in many ways. And by tackling the root causes, we will successfully possibly be able to address these various issues rather than looking at them in this very atomized way, you know, focusing just on taxing unhealthy foods. Things have to be looked at in a far more, from a far more holistic perspective.
Now, Kate, you talked about the nanny state a bit earlier. Let's just have a look at the front page of The Spectator, your publication. Nanny Boris. I mean, this is a bit of a turn-up, isn't it? I mean, what's interesting about this is that he himself, after suffering from COVID and being extremely ill, actually talked about obesity and talked about himself. I think he called himself a fatty and said that actually your outcomes are far worse if you're overweight. So this is a health issue too, isn't it?
Of course, it's a health issue. It's also a real change of heart from the Prime Minister, who spent years making a ferocious defense of liberty, who rejected ID cards and yet is now bringing in vaccine passports, who rejected the nanny state and is now signing off all kinds of legislation to interfere in grown adult lives. And I think one of the most difficult things is that, yes, Boris has spoken about his own personal experience, but he hasn't spoken about why he thinks he needs to take what he's doing in his own life and put it upon everybody else in the country. We haven't really had him explain where this change of heart has really come from. And it makes one wonder to what extent he really held those principles of liberty and freedom close to his heart to begin with. And I agree with Emma and others that we have to look at this holistically. But when it comes to the specific policy of putting taxes on sugary and salty food, it is a policy that has been tried in other parts of the world, and it does not work to curb obesity. So yes, let's talk about things holistically, but let's also reject bad policy. Let's not start from the premise that this is going to work here when it didn't work in other places. Let's start from better premises that are actually rooted in some evidence to try to make people, enable people, if they so choose, to live happier and healthier lives.
I think we can see a lukewarm welcome there to that policy proposal. Now, let's move on to something else. Levelling up. The Prime Minister has been making a speech this morning in the last hour or so in Coventry, and he's been talking about the problem that he thinks levelling up could solve.
Governments have created a sort of Matthew effect. To him that hath shall be given. So you end up investing in areas where house prices are already high, where transport is already congested, and by turbocharging those areas, especially in London and the southeast, you drive prices even higher and you force more and more people to move to the same expensive areas.
Now, there has been some concern, I think maybe you could say, amongst maybe a few Conservatives, particularly in the South. This is how the Daily Telegraph has reported this, saying levelling up will not drag the South down, pledges Johnson, saying that really he's trying to reassure Conservatives, some of whom are pretty shocked by that defeat in Chesham and Amersham by-election at the hands of the Liberal Democrats last month, trying to reassure them that levelling up one area doesn't mean that another one is levelled down. And Laura, your constituency is relatively close to there. Are you concerned about that money might be diverted to other parts of England?
Well, I think one of the things about levelling up is because it's quite a sort of ambiguous phrase, it means whatever anyone wants it to mean. And after the general election, I think there was a sort of sense that levelling up meant focusing kind of funds and resources into the northern towns and the way they changed their heart. And there was a sense that the government needed to justify their vote. But I think that there has sort of I think there's been a lot of distraction around the COVID sort of management, but I think there has actually been a lot of really important government policy which goes much wider than the regional variation. One example, for example, is the lifetime skills guarantee that was announced, which gives, I think, up to 11 million adults the chance to retrain at any point in their life, to take out a student loan as if they were, a teenager again, and to continue to develop their skills so that they remain engaged and evolving in the labour market. I mean, that's a massive policy for life chances.
But you say it's an ambiguous phrase, and there are lots of people who say that's all it is. It's a slogan, it's a phrase, it doesn't mean anything.
So what I mean by that is it was used a lot in the general election campaign. And just at the point when the government could have been expected to start putting flesh on the bones, we went into a lockdown. I mean, I'd only been an MP for 11 weeks when I was exclusively working from home. I didn't know the name of all my colleagues. And then I think it is fair to say that the vast majority of the last 18 months has been talking about something else. So this was the Prime Minister's first opportunity to put some meat on the bones. And he said things that we already knew, but they're still stark, Vicky. It is still stark to hear that a pupil premium kid in London has double the chance of ending up at university as a child in receipt of pupil premium anywhere else in the country.
Is, we do know the problems, though. I mean, this is not new. We've heard this an awful lot. And I think the issue now is that it's still not entirely clear what the Prime Minister is going to do about it. I mean, his speech today was a little bit unfocused. I mean, he raised a lot of the issues. But apart from wanting some votes in the north of England, I think a lot of people will say they don't know what it means.
I don't think that's fair. I think he talked about education. He talked about public services. He talked about policing. He talked about, I think he called them the sinews of our country. And he doesn't just mean the high-spend sort of infrastructure projects that get all the headlines. He talked about gigabit, and we all know it sounds like a small thing to say, but it's true. A year and a half ago, none of us had a Zoom meeting. Now we have them every day of our lives, and we know that technology will evolve. But it does have serious ramifications for what the future of some towns and areas that have previously been disconnected could look like. It does change how people can live in those places, what their professional opportunities might look like. It does take some of the fundamental injustices that have plagued regional inequality. And so I think it was the chance for him to say, no, it isn't just about pouring money into northern towns, and it shouldn't be constructed in that way.
And Anas, he's talking about, the Prime Minister, about spreading opportunity, spreading funding, across the UK. That must be something that you agree with.
I think the problem you've got is, as Laura says, cut through the ambiguous term, and you have got the most divisive Prime Minister we've perhaps ever had in our country. It's someone who is all about dividing different communities and within communities in different parts of the country.
He says he wants to unite them and keep the United Kingdom united.
Let's look at his record. He is not an all of us Prime Minister, he's an us and them Prime Minister. And sadly, we've got an us versus them First Minister in Scotland as well. And it's all about fighting cultural wars, dividing individual communities to try and build up an electoral coalition to stay in power rather than genuinely transforming our country. If he really...
let's just stick to the levelling up agenda.
If he really wants to make levelling up work, then he's got to recognise that we had structural inequalities leading up to the pandemic. They have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and the real levelling up should be pushing power and resource out from Westminster to the nations and regions of the UK. That includes to Scotland, but within Scotland, from Holyrood out to to the regions of Scotland, particularly the city regions, and therefore back that up with financial resource, back that up with support, not rhetoric, and not trying to divide communities, which is what this Prime Minister does every single day.
Well, I just wanted to come back, and I understand why Anas wants to kind of push against the Conservative Party, but I think if you're going to make the sort of suggestion that the Prime Minister or that the government is divisive, then you still have to explain the 2019 general election result, which saw, which took in everything from towns that had never considered voting Conservative before.
I can give you a simple answer to that, Laura. The simple answer to that is the Labour Party wasn't good enough. And I'm not shy about saying that. That doesn't mean the Prime Minister's not divisive. That doesn't mean he's not pulling people apart. We're going to have a debate about racism later.
Seats that have never ever
voted. What does Labour do about that? Keir Starmer is starting a tour of the United Kingdom, a summer tour. What's he going to do about it? What advice have you given to him?
Well, simply, directly, I said this to Keir Starmer this week, is directly, Labour cannot win an election, and it's not right to do anyway, by having our own version of an us versus them, not making half of the population angry with another half of the population in order to gain electoral success. The only route back is that we challenge head-on the us versus them politics. We challenge head-on this idea that you've got to divide communities in order to get ahead, how we bring our country together and have an all of us, so we confront the challenges like poverty, which you spoke about before, so we can confront the structural deficiencies that we see right across our UK. The fact that it's not just Glasgow and Edinburgh, but also Cardiff, Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, parts of London that feel disconnected from the UK government, feel disconnected from Boris Johnson and the Tories. That is truly what leadership is about. Muscular unionism and this rhetoric of division is not going to save the United Kingdom, and it's neither going to allow the United Kingdom to prosper.
Do people feel disunited? Do they feel very much not a part of this government?
I don't recognise everything that Anas is saying, and I also think the story of some of those seats, it was not just about one moment in time when the Labour Party wasn't good enough, although I do agree the Labour Party wasn't good enough, I have to be honest. It was the beginning of, I think, a slow change that had been developing over decades, not just, a blast sort of event. But I do think, actually, I think we've sort of been reasonably united in our approach to the last 18 months as a nation, but we've been in kind of combat mode because we've gone through this process of living like hermits to try and tackle an unknown threat, and then we've gone through the vaccination process. I think it was absolutely right that this was the moment when the Prime Minister had to put flesh on the bones, because this is the moment when his domestic agenda starts to become a reality.
Let's pick that up with Kate. Let's pick that up with Kate. Have you managed to learn anything today about what levelling up means?
I learned that Boris Johnson is more defensive, I think, about this strategy, and perhaps realizing that he's going to need to pad it out eventually. But no, I wouldn't say I learned much today. In fact, I probably became slightly more confused. I agree with Laura that the term is ambiguous. I would go a step further. I would say that it's become a very empty term. Now, it is not the Prime Minister or Conservative government's fault that we went into an 18-month pandemic in and out of lockdowns and the rest of it. They had to focus elsewhere. The problem for them now, as we saw in the last by-election, is that in some parts of the country, the term is actually becoming slightly toxic. It does feel like it's dividing parts of the country. And I felt today the Prime Minister was defensive, trying to suggest that levelling up will mean something to everyone. But he ended up contradicting other parts of his policy. He said that he wants to encourage investment to the UK. Well, why are we hiking corporation tax and actually encouraging other countries around, probably going to try to force other countries around the world to do the same? He talked about how levelling up meant that people wouldn't come and move to other areas in the south and want to build homes there, and they wouldn't want to overpopulate those areas. Well, how does that line up with the rhetoric about how we're going to have one of the biggest house building initiatives that we've seen in generations, that young people need to get on the housing ladder, that they should be able to do that where and when and how they want to do that? It really felt at moments like he was contradicting other parts of his public policy. And this is the difficult thing when you come up with a slogan that works very well in elections, but doesn't have a lot of meat on the bones. You end up trying to please everybody. And Boris Johnson, in many ways, I think, is a people pleaser. But in a speech like this, it becomes very clear where those contradictions are. So I must say, he's going to have to really figure out what the public policy is. Otherwise, people are only going to become more confused about how this fits in with the rest of his agenda.
OK, Laura, what do you say to that? No policy there.
Oh, sorry, I don't want to interrupt, I think.
OK, Emma, what were you saying?
Yeah, I would just like to make a little contribution to this whole levelling up debate. I don't think it can be had outside of the context that we have a decade of Tory austerity that has resulted in, council budgets being cut by 15 billion. So that context, needs to be centred, 15 billion pounds in cuts. So there seems like an inherent contradiction between this spoken desire to level up and then the actions that have actually been taken. And secondly, this pitting oppressed and marginalized and intentionally impoverished groups against each other, which seems again to be characteristic of the moment that we are that we are in, but is something with a long history, is historically proven to be a very, very successful method for distracting people, for distracting communities from identifying or thinking about or focusing on the real causes of their impoverishment
Laura,
and their exploitation.
Do you want to answer that?
Vicki, just briefly, I will. I think that the comment was made that there had been a decade of underinvestment, and I think I think you see through the Levelling Up Fund, the Towns Fund, which has awarded about £100 million to 70 different areas, there is already meaningful money coming into those places which have suffered from underinvestment. Actually, I would take issue with some of the reasons that were given, but I think one of the things that we've definitely, there's some evidence around in a number of places in the UK where people expressing that they felt that their towns had become very different from the places they grew up in, that they were maybe more dangerous, that they'd lost some of their sort of civic roots, marketplaces and so on. And that's exactly what things like the town funds are meant to do. But just very briefly, as a rejoinder, if levelling up isn't meant to be about identifying those communities and those areas that are struggling and about providing a meaningful plan for government to bring them up and to improve their life chances, and I'm not quite sure what else is. And so I don't even know if me and Emma are really disagreeing with one another, other than almost misunderstanding each other, perhaps.
And Anna, so if I could just ask you about, you talked about the Prime Minister being divisive, not having a plan. I mean, what is Labour's plan in all of this? Do you have a levelling up agenda?
Look, I think absolutely. So I think for Labour, and this is the case I would make to my colleagues in the UK-wide Labour Party, is, look, as a party that believes in the principle of devolution, this is about pushing power and resource out of Westminster into the nations and regions. So as a party that has a history of believing in devolution, we've got to put the meat and the bones of what that devolution actually means and how we empower those city regions in particular. You've seen it, for example, in Manchester, in Liverpool and in other places. Actually put economic resources in there, because the reality is we aren't going to get, we've heard a lot about a recovery and making a recovery work in terms of build back better and quotes like that are used. The reality is you're only going to have a recovery that works for everyone if you recognise that different solutions are going to be needed in different parts of the country. So different solutions in Scotland, for example, from different solutions in Wales, and different solutions in those regional metro areas. So let's push power out, let's push resource out, let's make tackling poverty the central mission around that, because if you put tackling poverty as your central mission, that means reshaping your economy. It means investing in the economies of the future, for example, the green economy, investing in well-paid, meaningful jobs, and also putting money in people's pockets so they can make better choices in their lives.
OK. Thank you very much. Now let's move on to COVID, and let's take a look at the front page of the FT today. Businesses sapped by staff shortages as COVID app orders workers home. Up to 20% of staff absent. Factory shops and the NHS are being hit, it says. And I think we all know from our own circle of friends and colleagues that this is happening an awful lot, not just, of course, people who have got COVID themselves, but being contacted by the app, come into contact with people. And our colleague Lewis Goodall here has tweeted some numbers to put it into context, saying that over 420,000 people were pinged in England by the Test and Trace app in the week ending July the 7th. That's up 46% and the greatest number since January. Now, Kate, this is obviously proving incredibly disruptive. We've heard about the Nissan factory. We've got, of course, lots of NHS staff, lots of public services struggling, and the hospitality sector with lots of cafes, restaurants not even able to open. What is the answer to this?
We need to rethink fundamentally what the test and trace system is supposed to do. And we need to remember that this was a system that was designed before we had a working vaccine. And, these were ideas and these were plans that we came up with when we thought that living with the virus possibly meant that nobody was going to have antibodies that weren't built up from anything other than actually being infected with the virus, i.e. no vaccines. And so the idea that you would try to allow people to more or less go about their lives, but if there were any question of contact with the virus, they had to go inside, was something the government had to consider. But now, of course, we have this incredible success story. We have multiple working vaccines that have a higher efficacy than most people dreamed we would actually find last year. It means that people are significantly safer, and it means that we can consider, I think, going back to the way that we once lived in a far more excited way, and in a way that isn't going to put so many lives at risk. And it's very clear now that the test and trace system, as it's operating, is not going to be fit for purpose as we go into the summer. And it does not make sense that you're telling people that it's so-called Freedom Day on the 19th of July, when you're seeing the numbers that you just listed there, Vicki, when you're going to especially have young people, many of whom won't have had their second jab when we get to mid-August, and you will be allowed to skip quarantine if you've been double jabbed, who are going to be told to go inside when they're also being told this is the first time in 16 months that you've been allowed to really go about your life again. So I really think we need a rethink of this test and trace system.
Okay.
If it's not going to shut down big parts of our economy and also disproportionately affect young people.
So, Laura, we did have some suggestion that the app might be changing on Monday. It's unclear whether that is going to happen. Is it going to be tweaked?
So I've been following that story too, and I don't know. But I look, I don't resile from the fact that it's extremely onerous and disruptive to have so many people being asked to self-isolate. But I take a different view from Kate, actually. We now know that on the 16th of August, when I think we should be at least 3/4 as a nation double vaccinated, that if you are double vaccinated, the requirement to isolate will change and will be substituted by testing. I actually don't think it will disproportionately affect young people, because the vaccination programme became open to them from about the second last week of June. They will, by the middle of August, be eligible for their second vaccination. Whether they'll have come forward or not may be a different question, because we'll be getting to the 8-week period. So actually, I think it's been time to coincide with when everybody in the country will be eligible for a second vaccination. I think the problem will melt away naturally at that point.
OK, let's bring in Kirsten Oswald now, who is the Deputy Westminster Leader of the SNP. Welcome to you. And just looking at the situation in Scotland, I mean, you have your own app, but there is a suggestion that actually people just aren't downloading it, or they're not using it, certainly. Is it the same problem there?
No, that's not the situation that I'm hearing from people. I think people in general have really stepped up and are trying very hard to do the right thing, to follow the guidance that's in place, and to take the steps that we all can to keep those around us safe. So I think that the picture that we're seeing here as we're moving towards less restriction, I think is one that people are responding to positively. I think that some of the differences that we see in the approach in Scotland, so the situation with face coverings, for instance, where the First Minister has been very clear that face coverings are going to be around here for some time to come. I think that's something that people welcome, and that more cautious approach and the clarity on that, because I think that with the best will in the world, there's been a bit of a lack of clarity regarding face coverings in terms of the UK government approach.
Kirsten, can I just get back to the app for a second, because this was a BBC Scotland story saying that less than half of COVID app downloads are active. So people have downloaded it, but it's not active. So it's not working.
I think that people are actually using the app, and I think that the data bears that out. If you look at the data for the test and protect element as well, and the Scottish Government has invested significantly further in that, and I think all of these things do matter. So there's a number of things that we all can do and that we all should do, whether that is making sure that our apps are downloaded and active, as you say, making sure that we do get vaccinated. If you've not been vaccinated, then please take steps to go and do that. It's been made as easy as possible for people, or whether it's things like making sure to wear face coverings. And I was just looking at listening rather to your previous programme element there about working and how and where people work. And I think that the other issue, which is slightly different in Scotland, is that people are continuing to be asked to work from home where that's possible. And of course, it's not possible in all jobs, but where that is possible, again, it takes some of that strain away and means that we are in that better position as we move towards a more open situation.
So you've talked a bit about being still quite cautious, but Scotland is moving down to level 0 on Monday. I mean, how different really is that to what the approach is in England?
That there are always differences in approach because, quite rightly, the different governments are taking the steps that they deem necessary and appropriate for people in these particular countries. So the approach that the Scottish Government is taking is the approach that is best for the people who live here. And I think that, if you think about some of the issues that I've talked about, I think the working from home guidance is something that people are interested in, for instance. I think that is helpful. I think that it does make a difference. It takes some of that burden away in terms of the concerns that people will have about infection in workplace. I think part of the context of that is that, as I said, there are a number of workplaces where it's not possible to do that. So, we need to build all of that in together. And that cautious and evidence-based approach is also what means that we will, and, I think that the evidence again shows that people are certainly content with this. We will be wearing face coverings in Scotland for some time to come. I think that is the right approach, and I welcome the First Minister's comments on that.
Alice, do you accept that the approach that the government in Scotland is taking is the right one?
I think the problem you've got is if you cut through the spin, the talk of the more cautious approach. Just last week, 6 of the 10 hotspots in Europe were in Scotland. So I don't think we can pick and choose when we want to compare ourselves with the rest of the UK. Last week, there were 6 out of 10 of the hotspots were in Scotland. And I think we have got a problem about inconsistent decision making and inconsistent communication. And an example of that is the fact we're going to level 0 next week. Level 0 does not mean 0 restrictions. And I think that in itself will confuse people, and asking people to go on a Scottish Government website to see what the modifications are of level 0, to be frank, isn't rooted in the real world. The idea that people that live every day
isn't it?
is going to log on is just not going to happen.
Level 0 doesn't mean 0 restrictions.
No, I don't think it is. And if I can just go back to what Anas said previously, I think that the point that he was making about hotspots that we'd seen in the past couple of weeks is an important one. None of the hotspots are in Scotland this week. And that is the nature of the coronavirus. That's the difficulty that everybody in the whole world has experienced all the way through this pandemic. If I can finish, Anas, if you don't mind, that's why it's important that we do have sensible, well-planned and evidence-based approaches. So that's why we are taking the steps that we are. And I think that people in Scotland and people across the UK actually have been very well able to work out, because of public health information, what is required of them. I don't think that there's an issue at all with people knowing what the guidance tells them to do.
And do you want to come back on that?
It's all there for them.
I mean, that was a point I was making about 2 weeks ago. We didn't want to compare ourselves, but now we want to compare ourselves and say the cautious approach is working. That's the very point I'm making, Kirsten. But I just don't think we're living in the real world if we don't think that these restrictions are confusing for people and the messages isn't consistent. So what we actually practically need to do about it, Test and Protect is going to have a role to play even when we get higher density of the vaccine, because we still need to isolate and close the virus. We have breached the WHO guidance for the last 2 weeks, if not more, on the test and trace capacity in Scotland. Kirsten can shake her head if she likes, but it's truth in Scotland, and people can see the facts from here in England as well. Is we have breached the WHO guidance on test and protect. We've got to fix the problems in test and protect. We've got to have much faster rollout of the vaccine. So
I welcome. To ask you about the vaccine.
Yeah, of course.
You've suggested, haven't you, reducing the time between the first and second jabs. But actually, if we look here at the front page of the Metro in Scotland, saying Labour Vax plan would put cases up, that actually in the end you don't end up with so much protection, so in the long run it would make it worse.
So I mean, I would contest that. And the reason I would contest that is we can't pick and choose when we want to listen to the WHO guidance. So the WHO guidance is clear that they recommend the vaccine is 3 to 4 weeks between 2 doses. The MHRA guidance is you can have the vaccine safely after 3 weeks. Canada, Australia, the US, other parts of the world are doing the double vaccines after 4 weeks. And the suggestion I'm making is if we have adequate supplies, if we recognise we have a crisis with the Delta variant right now, and the protection from the vaccine comes from the second dose with the Delta variant, then we should be open to looking at
But the JCVI has said don't do it.
Well, just within that, so Northern Ireland today has said they're going to reduce from the 8 weeks to 6 weeks. And Northern Ireland saying that is within the JCVI guidance. So if Northern Ireland are saying they can reduce the time within the JCVI guidance, I don't see why governments elsewhere can't look at the scientific evidence and look at that advice to see if they can do that differently here. The CDC has recommended that in the US. The WHO is saying that. This is not some kind of dangerous thought by a political party or irresponsible to ask.
Kirsten,
that is the World Health Organization.
What do you say to that?
Thank you. I think that what we need to do is to stick to what the JCVI are saying, and that is what the Scottish Government has done all the way through the pandemic, to make sure that we know what the reliable scientific advice is from the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, and to follow that. Now, we are always and will always be open to continuing to review what is happening, but it must be based on that fundamental guidance. I don't think that it's helpful or sensible to suggest that we do otherwise. I think it's absolutely right that that's what the Scottish Government has done all the way through the pandemic, and I think that it's absolutely right that that is what they continue to do.
Okay, Emma, on the vaccination programme, there seems to have levelled off a bit, particularly amongst younger people. Do you think there is still hesitancy?
I'm not sure that there's
hesitant. Was that to me?
Emma, yes.
Hesitancy in terms...
Taking up the vaccine.
Sorry, I missed what you said.
Hesitancy in taking up the vaccine, particularly amongst younger people?
I mean, this is on anecdotal and evidence, but from what I've seen, no. Younger people that I've spoken to or that I know are keen to be vaccinated generally as quickly as possible.
Kate, do you agree?
Look, I think young people across the UK, frankly, have proven that they are willing to do what it takes to get us out of this crisis. The UK ranks at the top of the list of countries worldwide that wants to take its vaccine. But I think Ines is completely correct. We need to be getting jabs into arms, and those who want to come forward slightly earlier to get their second jab should be widely encouraged to do so. It is ridiculous to pretend that the scientific advice isn't there. If we look at other developed Western countries and the way that they're delivering this vaccine, between roughly 3 to 12 weeks seems like a very safe and very good time to get your second jab. And if people want to come forward at week 4 to do so, we should encourage them. Then we can go back around, target the people who have not been getting their jabs, and hopefully help to encourage and educate them as to why they should.
OK, well, we're out of time on this one, but thank you very much to Kirsten for joining us. Let's move on now to discuss really what has been the story of the week following, of course, a football match. England losing that final, but then it very quickly becoming a story about something else with the racist abuse which was suffered by a number of England players. And it really has sparked a much wider debate about racism in British society. Let's look here at the headline in the Times. And this was from the chief of MI5 saying Britain must shoulder the blame for racist trolls, and saying you can't just dismiss this as a problem coming from overseas accounts. Emma, you've written about this extensively. What have you made about the whole conversation this week? Not really just about taking the knee, but broaden it out to more broadly in British society.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be uncontroversial to acknowledge that racism, is deeply embedded in British society. And I think what happened to the footballers last week is that kind of explicit, inarguable type of racism that most people can express horror at, but it really shouldn't distract us from the fact that the more systemic, it's all part of the same ecosystem, but we really have to work at addressing and overcoming the systemic institutional racism that exists, and the fact that people from ethnically diverse backgrounds still face, huge inequalities across health, the criminal justice system, education, employment, housing. And this remains to be addressed. There doesn't seem to be any real commitment to that with the current government. Rather than acknowledge this reality and think about ways we can address it and move forward, the strategy appears to be, well, what about the white working class? And indeed, what about the white working class? They also, as they're known, I take issue with that whole phrasing, which I can get into as well. But yes, inequality is rife in this country.
Let's just bring in Kate there. Kate, do you agree with that? Systemic racism, and really that the British society is in denial about it?
Well, I have absolutely no doubt that racism still exists in British society today, and unfortunately in many developed countries across the world. And I agree that there's far more we can do about it. One thing that frustrated me this week was that the Conservative government kept backtracking on its original stance on taking the knee. Now, you don't have to personally endorse that or do that, but there is this new sense that whenever we have discussions about race, we have to tie it into the culture wars. It has to have a political agenda. Well, taking the knee actually originated from a sports star, Colin Kaepernick, in America with American football, who was doing it, to Emma's point, to protest structural racism issues in the States, which we've all, if we weren't aware of them before last summer, have all become very aware of since George Floyd's murder. And I think the government really misjudged this. But the question for me now is, I don't like the phrase gesture politics, because I think gestures can be good. I think the question is now, what are we going to do with this conversation that's played out? And as Emma says, I think a lot of people have been extremely sympathetic to why the football players did it and where they were coming from, and have been disgusted to see some of the abuse that they've gotten. But for example, how are we going to deal with Qatar next year? The fact that our football players are going to be playing on what is essentially a grave site.
Sorry, Kate, just quickly, Laura, the government's misjudged this.
Can I just come back? I want to just pick up on something that Emma said about the ugly explosion on Sunday night being something that no one would disagree with as a site of sort of obvious racism. And often racism is much more subtle than that. I'm just going to answer. I spent 12 years as a discrimination lawyer before I became an MP, and I was counsel to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And in the extent that I dealt with cases in court on race, I thought the combination of the Equality Act and its legacy legislation, the Race Relations Act, had led to great strides in employment and in education and in some service delivery. But I do think that racism lingers in our society. I think it's prevalent in some aspects of public life, sport being a particularly stark example, but I think there is a sort of grey zone. And I want to also agree with Kate.
We're running out of time. Anas, one very quick thought from you, and then back to Anna.
We can't separate our politics, our political discourse, our political language and narrative from the racism that exists in our societies. If you have us versus them cultures, if you pit communities against each other, if you have the spread of poverty and inequality, you're going to have injustice and racism as a result, as well as sexism and other forms of prejudice and hate as well. So let's change our political discourse and not just have politicians tweeting when there's a trending hashtag, but actually taking the meaningful action so we can change our society.
Emma, last word, 15 seconds.
Yeah, absolutely. I think pitting different exploited groups against each other has been a really successful tool for mobilizing people against, voting and behaving in their own best interest. And the whole thing of pitting the white working class against minorities is something that we need to be very, very mindful of.
We have to leave it there, Emma. Thank you very much, and thanks to all my guests.